It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Tanner Lecture on Human Values. I'm Tad Schmaltz. I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at Michigan. President Domenico Grasso is going to introduce our speaker, Lea Ypi. But first I wanted to say just a few words about the Tanners and the Tanner Lectures. The Tanner Lectures on Human Values, administered by the Philosophy Department, was permanently endowed by Grace Adams Tanner and Obert Tanner in 1978. However, a lecture at Michigan the previous year by the political and legal philosopher Joel Feinberg inaugurated the series. In addition to Michigan, 5 other institutions were originally designated as permanent sponsors of the lectureship. So Clare Hall at the University of Cambridge, Brasenose College at the University of Oxford, Harvard University, Stanford University, and the University of Utah. Yale University and the University of California, Berkeley were added as sponsors in 1987, and Princeton University was added in 1988. Over the years, Tanner Lectures have been delivered at other universities throughout the world. The lectures themselves are published in an annual volume. The Tanners, who endowed this lecture series, had broad intellectual interests. Grace Tanner's interest inclined toward the sciences, especially biology and anthropology. Obert Tanner studied at the University of Utah in philosophy and law. After receiving his law degree, he studied and taught philosophy and religious studies at Harvard University and Stanford University, and was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utah for 27 years. He also was a successful businessman, having founded in 1927 the O.C. Tanner Company, which produces a range of jewelry that businesses use to reward individual accomplishments. And that company actually struck the medals for the Winter Olympics when it was held in Salt Lake City. The Tanners were generous philanthropists. They supported the Utah Symphony Orchestra, Ballet West, and the Utah Opera Company. They also built more than 40 public fountains and established philosophy libraries at 11 major colleges and universities, including our own splendid Tanner Library here at the University of Michigan in Angel Hall. Tanner Library in Angel Hall. Over the years, many distinguished intellectual figures have delivered the Tanner Lectures at Michigan, including Sir Karl Popper, Toni Morrison, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and John Rawls. Here at Michigan, it is our practice to take the Tanner Lectures as the occasion for a thorough consideration of its ideas. Each year, we have a program the morning following the lecture in which scholars from various disciplines offer perspectives on the lecture and join in a panel discussion. This year's symposium will be held tomorrow morning from 10 to 12:30 right here in Rackham Amphitheater. And our symposists this year are Elizabeth Anderson, my colleague at the University of Michigan, Philip Kitcher of Columbia University, and Daniel Wodak of the University of Pennsylvania. So please do come out tomorrow and hear the discussion after the lecture. To introduce this year's Tanner Lecture, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Domenico Grasso, who was appointed president of the University of Michigan in May. He also serves as professor of civil and environmental engineering at the university and has a secondary appointment as professor of sustainable engineering at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. President Grasso is a Michigan alum who earned his doctorate in environmental engineering in 1987. As an environmental engineer, his research focuses on the molecular scale processes that govern the ultimate fate of contaminants in the environment and on the development of new technologies to reduce risks to human health and natural resources. He was a member of the World Bank-funded international team of scholars that established the first environmental engineering program in Argentina. For the previous 7 years, President Grasso has served as an executive officer at the university and as chancellor of the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Before joining UM Dearborn, President Grasso served as provost of the University of Delaware, and prior to that, he held various leadership positions at the universities of Vermont and Connecticut and at Smith College. Please join me in welcoming President Grasso.
Thank you very much, Ted. Thank you very much, Ted, and I want to thank the philosophy department for hosting this important lecture. I'm so glad that Ted shared the history of the Tanner Lecture and our university's involvement since the start of the series. This is a signature event here at Michigan, and I'm honored to be part of it this year. I had the opportunity, along with my wife Susan, who's here as well, to spend time with the presidents and chancellors of the other Tanner institutions, the other 8 institutions, which they host a different meeting every year at one of the campuses. This year, it was at Harvard University. And as you might imagine, there was no shortage of both topics to cover and opinions to share. These are challenging times for higher education, and we face skepticism and criticism, much of which I believe is ungrounded. And being a good engineer during these meetings, I was taking notes furiously during the conversations and chastised immediately when I started taking notes because they said that these were private conversations and nothing was to leave the room so everybody could speak freely. So I had to erase all my notes. They were on an iPad. So I have no recollection of what we talked about. Yet, it has caused many of us to realize that it is more important than ever for our institutions, particularly our faculty, to demonstrate how we contribute to improving the world around us. That impact includes our shared values of open discourse and exchange of ideas. We must continually uphold our universities as places that respect differences in opinions, share new ideas, and engage in difficult conversations. No other institution in our country places such a high value on this depth of discourse. Hosting an annual lecture on human values embodies this ethos. It also reflects our look to Michigan vision, including our commitment to advancing democracy, civic, and global engagement. This is why I'm so pleased to tell you about this year's lecturer. Lea Ypi is a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, with a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She explores and explains the world as a philosopher, an academic, and a storyteller. She's a bold thinker who examines the meaning of freedom and the many ways different political systems interpret it. She has continued this exploration in her memoir, Free, about coming of age in communist Albania in the 1990s. Her latest book, Indignity, A Life Reimagined, is an exploration of her grandmother and family secrets. Prospect Magazine has called her one of the most important thinkers in the world. We are honored that she is this year's Tanner Lecturer and look forward to her message. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ypi.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be giving this lecture on the topic of political progress. What is political progress? One answer comes from Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain, and more specifically from the reactionary NAFTA, who's one of the characters in the novel, who says, Progress is the cry of the patient who constantly changes his position, thinking each new one will bring him relief. The unconfessed, he says, the unconfessed but secret general desire for war is another manifestation of the same. And when I was rereading these exchanges between him and the other character, his alter ego, who thinks the exact opposite, Settembrini, and I was preparing for my Tanner lecture, and I was still in London, and I was worried about whether I would actually make it safely across the borders, and started thinking about my social media activity, tried to think about my tweets from many years ago, and whether they would compromise me, and whether I would actually be able to even come at all, having been an Albanian citizen and a British citizen with a Muslim family and so on. I started wondering, why did I always, when I read this novel, agree so much with Settembrini, the other guy, the non-reactionary, who is a cosmopolitan, who is someone who believes in progress, who is someone who believes in the fundamental goodness of human nature, and he thinks it's only a matter of time until we realize the rational world order. And I thought, well, as I was reading these remarks from NAFTA, I was thinking, isn't this what he says about progress as this cry of the patient who is just trying to change his position? Isn't that a much more realistic picture of what we are after and what society is about? And shouldn't we just accept what NAFTA urges us to accept, which is we just have to take people as they are, and we have to accept that progress and destruction, war, as he says, are just two sides of the same coin, and there is nothing more that we can say about each of them. So it's kind of strange to think about this topic of political progress in a time where a lot of what surrounds us seems to be pointing in the exact opposite direction of what we would normally think of as progress. So on a lot of issues, from individual justice to collective rights, from the distribution of wealth and the oligarchization of democratic politics, from the replacement of this language of shared humanity that is a premise of thinking about progress with the language of identity and exclusion and supremacy. It seems that this long arc of the moral universe is actually increasingly bending away from justice rather than towards justice. And on the other hand, maybe it's exactly in moments like this what we need to ask ourselves the question of political progress and have an answer to what counts as political progress and to also why we care about progress. So today I'm just going to try and approach this question by focusing mainly on three more specific issues. The first one, defend the idea that political progress is a species of moral progress. Then explain why we need the idea of progress, and then finally share some thoughts on some criteria that we might help ourselves to when we think about what counts as political progress, and hopefully that will also help us in thinking about progress in the context of political conflict of the present. So let me start with the first. Political progress is a species of moral progress. And so to say that means to insist that politics and morality are in continuity rather than in a relationship of antagonism to each other, and they're not entirely separate from each other. Now, of course, the reaction to that is there is a very familiar view of politics that is traceable to Machiavelli, but maybe also to Thrasymachus before him, that sees politics as the exact opposite, that says that we need politics precisely because we can't rely on morality and moral norms. So as Machiavelli memorably puts it, he says, we can say this about human beings, that they are ungrateful, fickle, simulators and deceivers, avoiders of dangers, and greedy for gain. But to say what Machiavelli is just saying, which is that these better angels of our nature are not always reliable, isn't the same thing as saying that morality and politics are completely different from each other. Because it seems to me that the motivational difficulties that we have for acting a certain way can be separated from the moral reasons that we have to act that way. So even if people don't always act morally, even if political morality is a very particular kind of morality, the standards of morality and the standards of politics don't need to be completely separated from each other. So now comes another critique of this position, in some ways an even more fundamental critique, more fundamental objection about this relationship between morality and politics. And so instead of thinking about the connection between political norms and moral norms more generally, or defending the autonomy of political norms, which are still norms from moral norms, this position claims that actually moral norms are nothing but a brute manifestation of power, and more specifically of political power. And I want to call this the Mephistophelian position, because it's actually Mephistopheles who, in Goethe's Faust, famously claims that reason is called reason only, and I quote, so that its power is increased to be far beastlier than the beast. So this is the devil's perspective, and it's telling that it's the devil's perspective. But actually, even the devil has its philosophical champions. So the idea that morality is nothing other than the will of the powerful, which is dressed up as reason, or even universal reason, to make sure that people comply and obey with the norms that that people in power give to their subordinates, is another familiar position from Thrasymachus to Nietzsche and beyond. And it's a position that has some appeal. It's actually surprisingly hard to argue against it. But when you think about it historically, with reference to the evolution of norms, leads to what Kant has famously called moral terrorism. So this view that places such high premium on the wickedness of human nature so as to be incompatible with other things that humans also do, like cooperating with each other, like showing altruistic dispositions. And so if that conception of the source of morality was the only one and the only credible one, it seems hard to make sense of these other things that humans show us, that they care for each other, they care for their children, they care for other people. So the species, with that view, with that moral terrorist view, might have disappeared a long time ago. Now you might say, well, the jury is still out, maybe the species will disappear, and then Mephistopheles will have the last word. But still, most people who actually use the words good and bad, or just and unjust, to refer to leaders or to refer to regime types, they don't want to just take themselves to be merely describing instances of power that depart from these standard claims. So they're not really just saying, this is the degree of ruthlessness. When we say something is better or worse, what we're describing is just the degree of ruthlessness with which someone exercises power and the degree of effectiveness in generating norms out of that ruthlessness. So they take themselves to be doing something else when they when they use this concept of good and bad and just and unjust. They're not just describing this instance of the powerful subordinating the powerless. And when, for example, even someone like Machiavelli in the Discourses of Livy urges his readers to reflect on the virtues of Republican Rome, so that he says, quote, those who read these statements of mine can more easily draw from them the utility that one should seek from the knowledge of history, he's actually offering not that account, but a different account of how morality and politics relate to each other, somehow presupposing that they are related. And that account presupposes not just that morality and politics are related, but that there is also a sense in which we learn through history from instances of political practice. And so that assumption that we make about the connection between past and present, Machiavelli says, runs against a lot of the common sense assumptions of his contemporaries, but often also our contemporaries, which is that they take pleasure in, he says about his contemporaries, they take pleasure in reading these stories of the past as if they were just stories, thinking that we can't really imitate them because there's nothing that connects the present to the past. And so he says they judge, I quote, that imitation is not just difficult, but impossible, as if heaven, sun, elements, men had varied in motion, order, and power from what they were in antiquity. And it's interesting that he has this analogy between the scientific world and the moral world and how humans show features in each of them. And his effort, he says, is the opposite. He wishes to, again, continues the quote, to turn men from this error guided by a philosophical reading of history that examines the successes and the failures of the past so that one can learn from them to navigate, as Machiavelli tried to do, the crisis of the Florentine Republic, the crisis of the present. And that's where we see this connection between the idea of progress and history, and the sense that without some notion of progress, our engagement with history becomes either purely descriptive or cynical. We can catalog events, we can list rulers, we can give names of different sites of struggles, and we can talk about what happened, but we lose the capacity to connect what happened in the past to what we're after in the present. And we lose the capacity to connect on how different historical trajectories relate to each other and relate to us as well. And so in that sense, if we care about this capacity to learn from the past in the way in which Machiavelli urges us to do, progress isn't just an empirical generalization about the world, but it's a kind of moral horizon within which we structure our judgments of the present with this effort to learn from the past and with an idea that we can then shape normative expectations for the future by doing so. So progress then seems to be, from this story, a sort of necessary idea that we need when we're thinking about history in a philosophical way. And this takes me to the second question that I wanted to raise, which is, what is the status of this idea? What does it mean to believe in progress? What does it mean to make claims about progress? And I think here it's helpful to explain the epistemic status of the claim in terms of a propositional attitude that is located between two extreme kinds of belief. So the first one is the belief that progress is impossible. And that sounds plausible, but it's almost trivial. Because the position seems to gain strength just from the weakness of the alternative. And the alternative account, the one that says that progress is impossible, is weak because it commits to a form of prophetic theorizing about the future. So this says, we suggest progress is possible, the alternative says progress is impossible. The alternative is just basically predicting a future course of events without actually being able to give us evidence for how they're basing, what they're grounding that prediction in. So the second one is that moral progress is necessary. That's the second extreme. So the first one is that progress is not impossible. The second one is that it's necessary. And that's too strong because in arguing the case, we seem to misunderstand the nature of the agents that are committed to certain normative statements and are responsible for directing their moral actions in a certain way in the world. And it's a sort of, again, what Kant called prophetic history, because it's a history that would be warranted only if the prophet was able to act on the basis of the prophecies that they are making. So, as Kant says, quote, if we were able to attribute to the human being an inherent and unalterable goodwill, we would be able to predict the progress of the species towards the better because it would concern an event that the human produces by themselves. But the problem is that the human doesn't have just this inherently goodwill. There are other motives to their actions, and those motives are often mixed, and the good and the bad sometimes come together. And so it's really hard to know in advance what to expect exactly from beings that operate in this way, where there is an orientation to certain moral norms, but also a free will to depart from them and to pick what Kant would have called the evil motive. So to make claims about progress is to say a little bit more that progress is not impossible, and to say a little bit less than progress is necessary. And this is where this statement is located. And I think the most plausible account is one that understands progress as a type of problem solving. So one that focuses on how moral agency expresses itself in human history by thinking about particular social and political institutions as they promote or hinder this moral agency. And so I think Machiavelli's appreciation for the political virtues of the classical Roman Republic is one example of an instance of engagement with this question of making political progress or thinking about the virtues of the Roman Republic as a sign of progress. Another example is Kant's praise for the French Revolution as a sign of progress. And each of these focuses on particular historical episodes, are only intelligible when we think about history from a normative, from a moral, or some of the old-fashioned Enlightenment philosophers would have said from a conjectural perspective, that asks the question of what does it mean to look at history as if we were looking at this normatively purposeful, integrated whole, which puts together motives, practical actions, contingent events. And this analysis of history, as I want to suggest, is actually really important to understand the mechanisms through which specific social and political institutions or legal structures or cultural constructs contribute to this process of moral learning from the past and moral improvement overall. So this takes me to the third point that I wanted to make. If the category of progress captures this process of historical improvement of moral norms, what is the specificity of political progress within this category? And here I think it's helpful to turn to discussions on moral progress and to think about what's specific and what's different about political progress and how we might come up with an account of political progress that is a more specific way, a more specific instance of thinking about the general question of moral progress. So one way of understanding moral progress is to think of it as a process of functional refinement of other regarding norms. And on this account of moral progress, a body of moral norms is understood to be progressive if it contributes to the process of functional refinement of codes of conduct that help remedy altruism failures on the side of human beings in a way that is robust across cultural and temporal variations. And there are a lot of discussions, objections, criticisms to this way of thinking about moral progress and different ways in which one could answer them. But I'm going to now put that to one side and so assume that that account of moral progress is plausible and then think about, okay, what does this mean? What can we do with this account, this functional account, when we turn to the specific question of political progress as distinct from moral progress? And I think to return to some of the things that I was just saying, what makes the political a distinctive realm from the moral is that even if we assume that human beings have to some extent managed to overcome altruism failures and to develop altruistic dispositions and to overcome uncooperative behavior, there is a question of consistency around upholding these norms, which depends not just on what those who comply with those moral norms do, but also on what other people do. So that gives rise to two distinctive problems, which are at the heart of the political, of the question of the political. One has to do with the lack of assurance that even if you follow moral prescriptions, even if you do the right thing, other people might not do this. And I'm going to call this the problem of coordination of action. And the second has to do with the mechanisms of preservation of norms over time so that something can be developed beyond the lifespan of particular individuals. And I'm going to call this a problem of continuity. So I think the question of how the political relates to the moral hinges on these two distinct questions, one of coordination and one of continuity. And the familiar story in political philosophy that follows from this way of understanding the specificity of the political, as we know from people from Plato to Machiavelli, from Hobbes to Rousseau, from Kant to Hegel to Rawls, is that political institutions, what they do is they embody a kind of collective authority required to ensure this coordinated and continuous form of cooperation among human beings. And so this collective authority can be effective in a way that is interpersonal and intratemporal if it operates through this combination of sanctions, rules that discipline actions, and in a way, the overcoming of the limitations of moral persons doing the right thing, and in a way that is entrenched in political institutions, so that we can ensure this coordinated and continuous form of interrelation. So this is what a lot of political philosophers call just the use of power. This is what we do. When we act in the political, we invoke power, and the use of power is there so that individuals and agents can coordinate and continue their coordination in a certain way. So the exercise of political power is in many ways necessary to overcome the limits of altruistic norms and dispositions even if you concede that these norms and these moral norms and dispositions are essential to recognize the need for power. So this question of the genesis of power is slightly different from the question of justification of power. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is this generation and replication of political rule through the exercise of power is different from the generation of moral norms through voluntary efforts. So if we think about political progress in connection, but also as somewhat different from moral progress, the question is, what is the equivalent to the functional refinement of moral norms in the moral realm? And what is the functional refinement of the way in which power is exercised in the political realm? And how should we understand this process of functional refinement more specifically? And here's now my suggestion. I suggest that this is what justice does. I suggest turning to the concept of justice. So justice, we're often told, is the first virtue of social institutions, and whether that's always been the case or whether its prominence is due to the specific historical moment in which people decided to abandon accounts of the legitimacy of the divine right of kings or ways of thinking about justice-based norms that relied on family structures and so on, it doesn't really matter too much, because the point is that justice is important to us because norms of justice help us reflect on the way in which power is exercised and shapes social and political institutions, and raising questions around who holds power, how are they using it, for what purposes, and so on. So it seems to me that the norms of justice and the related concepts of authority, sovereignty, rule of law, order, foundational legal treaties and conventions, however we want to then further explain this, these norms of justice, they play in the political realm an analogous role to the norms of morality in the interpersonal realm. So when moral norms tell us how people ought to relate to each other, norms of justice establish how people ought to relate to each other in contexts where moral norms are insufficiently reliable and some form of collective authority is needed to establish and to maintain the use of power. And if the function of ethics is to remedy altruism failures, we might say the function of justice is to regulate the way in which collective authorities exercise their power. So if we think about moral progress as this process of functional refinement involving altruism failure, we can think of political progress as a process of refinement of justice norms. So again, very general story, over the course of cooperating to solve political problems, human beings will come up with principles and schemes for thinking and for addressing, for responding to political conflicts. And these conflicts sometimes are going to be about distributive and productive kinds. So they're going to be about resources, about the shape of the allocation, the production of material resources, so about the shape of the economy. Sometimes there are going to be recognitional conflicts about social roles and reciprocal recognition of social positions in relation to the role of different agents in society. So the nature of these problems is going to be different at different points in time, but as agents develop different interpretations of what power is, who can exercise it, with what reasons, and for what means, the norms of justice is plausible to think that might be progressively refined. So what exactly does this progressive refinement in the function of justice include? And one way to think about this is to think about the functional refinement of justice as the process of discovery of appropriate frameworks for justifying the power of political institutions, responding for what Bernard Williams calls a basic legitimation demand. So we don't need to think of this process as one that is always driven by reason giving or by moral norms or the peaceful endorsement of different alternatives. And we also don't have to think of this process as a linear process that occurs without any lapses to regressive forms of rule. Even when more progressive ones have become epistemically accessible. The point I'm making is that on the account that I'm suggesting, political progress can be conceived as a transformation in the normative relation between power and its justification. So while political rule first emerges from the use of power just to coerce, so just to exercise authority, the continued legitimacy depends on the articulation of power in terms of justice. And so the idea is, again, that over time, agents generate and refine their interpretations of justice, and these then become the standards against which authority is assessed. And these understandings evolve, and so then the justification for the use of power becomes more expansive, more publicly reasoned, and less reliant on pure coercion. So progress in this sense isn't just institutional change, it's the deepening of this central justificatory demand that is at the heart of justice in the way in which we try to think about the exercise of political power, and in the way that helps us distinguish between justified instances of the exercise of power from mere coercive rule. So this is basically the general story of how progress can be analyzed by thinking about this process of learning and adaptation and functional refinement of the norms of justice in the justification of the use of power. And again, my thinking here is very similar to how we think about shifts in scientific paradigms, where you can understand the shifts through this accumulation of anomalies and then the eventual reconfiguration of a theoretical framework that helps you make sense of this, and that then leads to the eventual reconfiguration of existing theoretical frameworks. So in the same way, I think changes in political order can be traced through crisis of legitimation and of response to this basic legitimation demand that exposes the limits of existing justificatory norms. And so these are crises that arise when existing structures of power can no longer accommodate the existing either distributional or recognitional conflicts that emerge, are generated by evolving social relations. And so, again, the story here is that there is a more recognitional way of thinking about this, more political way, so different regime types, aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, theocracy, technocracy, different ways of thinking about systems of political rule can be seen as responses to these recognitional problems. And likewise, you can also think about it from a more sort of materialist perspective, different modes of production, so slavery, slave-based, feudal, capitalist society are frameworks for organizing responses to distributive conflicts that develop over time. And so in this sense, political progress reflects this kind of contingent process of collective learning in which societies experiment with new justificatory strategies when old ones seem to no longer contain the kind of conflicts that they give rise to. So I'm going to now just go a little bit deeper and say something a bit more specific about how exactly we understand what counts as a refinement of a justice-based norm. And here, I think we can use, broadly speaking, 3 criteria, which I have labeled, for want of better terms, diagnostic criteria, innovating, and heuristic criteria. And so, very briefly, a diagnostic criterion is one that concerns the capacity of a theoretical framework of what justice requires to actually identify the grounds and the scope of a conflict, of a political conflict, at the appropriate level of analysis. Then so that's a diagnosis about what's going on, what's wrong in the world. Then there's this innovating criterion, which concerns the extent to which a theory develops principles that can preserve the benefits of previous theories, but also add content so that they can take care of new conflicts emerging. So there's an innovating capacity. You don't go back to lose, but you add on to, you preserve the benefits, but avoid the limitations or the pitfalls. And then finally, there's a kind of heuristic criterion that is about theory's ability to combine this innovation capacity with the diagnostic capacity in ways that generate also guidance for how you might think about risk or anticipating new challenges of the future. So in this sense, political philosophy is both empirically grounded, because it works in tandem with other social sciences to identify the grounds and the concerns and the conflicts and so on, but it's also normatively reconstructive and also forward-looking. So it comes out in response to demands for change, and it contributes to clarifying the rationale for change and articulating the principles that should guide our change. And so in that sense, again, a crisis or a period of crisis or contestation brings into focus the question of how existing justificatory frameworks might be rejected or revised or innovated or replaced by more adequate ones. And so we might say that a family of views is progressive to the extent that it refines the function of justice along those lines, and in a way that preserves the normative achievements of predecessors but avoids the limitations. And a view is regressive when it fails to do that. So this is all very abstract, so I'm going to now maybe give you an example to try and focus a little bit more the discussion and to think more about the connection between political philosophy and the real world. So In the diagnostic perspective, as I said, political philosophy is responding to political conflict, and it's examining the kinds of concerns and the commitments that existing instances of political conflict reveal, and it's asking the question of what groups, what agents are involved, what kind of demands are they making about the status quo, what kind of claims are they articulating, how do they think about the use of power and the justification of the use of power. And so in this sense, political theory is working in tandem with the social sciences here to just figure out what are to map out the conflicts in the world. And in a way helps clarify the kind of normative content or the normative terrain on which some of these struggles are conducted. Then you have a second stage where, again, political philosophy turns to the causes of these conflicts and asks itself, what do the frameworks of justice that we have give us in terms of being able to respond and to address these conflicts? In what way do they help us analyze and articulate and respond? Or is there something in the way we think about justice in its relationship to power that needs to change to account for these new struggles and new conflicts? And then finally, in the kind of heuristic stage, you have this capacity of normative frameworks to guide future reasoning by thinking and by anticipating new challenges that might emerge even if you were to adapt the frameworks of justice that we have. And so in this sense, according to all of these criteria, political progress isn't really a kind of linear march towards a given ideal that we already know of the perfect society, of how things should be done. It's rather a historically situated process through which agents refine the function of justice in response to ongoing conflict. So it's a much more pragmatic way of making sense of political change and political development. So let me think again, now go a little even more specific by thinking about an example that's always in my mind, which is how we think about conflicts around globalization in the present. And so think about the relationship, for example, of, I don't know, capitalism to the liberal democratic state. That's one conflict. In liberal democracies now, as we know, the status quo, the use of power, is contested from all kinds of agents, from Charlie Kirk to Greta Thunberg, from, I don't know, Occupy Wall Street to the MAGA movement. And sometimes the claims of groups that contest the status quo are actually similar because they often start with a moral critique of globalization. Then they highlight the power of economic elites in shaping the political world, and they often also highlight the marginalization of ordinary people. So how do we distinguish between progressive and regressive claims in this context? And can this account of moral progress help us make sense of what's going on in the political world? And there you need to go back to these three criteria. So it seems to me you have to ask yourself the question, which of these frameworks is, from a diagnostic perspective, more persuasive in thinking about the grounds and the scope of the conflicts in the world? And it seems to me that the most persuasive analyses are those that focus on the tension between representative claims of democratic institutions that are territorially bound within nation states on the one hand, and the types of injustices that are provoked by the expansion of global capital, so globalization, global capitalism, and the transnational nature of capitalist economic institutions. So this tension, we can see, again, this is not something that everyone would sort of agree with this, is not something that we're just theorizing in the abstract about. We observe this in the persistent gap, for example, between the formal equality that is promised by democratic citizenship and the kind of substantive inequalities that are generated by these processes of economic transformation, which limit the capacity of national parliaments, for example, to regulate and to pursue distributive principles. So it seems to me that if you're asking ourselves, we have these critiques of the present, and which one is regressive and which one is progressive, a critique that locates the source of democratic deficits at this systemic level, rather than attributing them to ad hoc failures, like the corruption of political elites, or the failures of policy, or the limitations of leadership. You know, you've often heard we don't have good leaders, or the deficits of cultural groups that are seen as unable to keep up with the demands of globalization. It seems to me that this type of response captures the conflict at a more appropriate level of analysis than one that reduces it to questions of membership, for example, or questions of belonging. So that's diagnostic. From an innovating perspective, again, a progressive normative response tries to retain the achievements of liberal democracy, so the principles that we have now articulated to respond to the use of power, so individual rights, constitutional protections, participatory institutions, while trying to work on the incapacity of these institutions to subject the market to democratic control. So this, again, might involve a theory that proposes also principles of economic democracy, transnational regulatory mechanisms, forms of political authority that extend beyond the power of the nation state, and therefore preserves the liberal commitment to freedom, but also addresses capitalism's structural domination. And finally, from a heuristic perspective, these theories are also inspired by a kind of global egalitarian approach to justice, which has a kind of potential to anticipate the emerging challenges that exacerbate this capitalism-democracy tension, including thinking about ecological crises or technological transformations of labor or intensified global interdependence. So this is broadly the framework, and this is one example of how we might think about this framework, and one example where we see that it matters whether we can make claims about political progress and political regress in addressing the political world and positioning ourselves. But now there is a sort of objection to this position that I've just articulated, which is we don't know if a particular practice is progressive, the critic says, unless we know the direction of its movement. And we can only know if a particular direction is right or wrong if we have access to an independent standard that tells us where to go. So if you want to maintain that political progress is made of correcting the mistakes of the past rather than being able to predict or foresee the future, how can we rely on actual historical practices? Because it seems that when we rely on this, when we move in this more fallibilist way rather than when we think about the approximation to the ideal, we have another difficulty, which is, isn't the historical survival of a political outlook, isn't that just not enough to say that the norms that underpin that transition are actually the right norms? So couldn't a particular set of norms prevail just because of coercion or just because of the power of those who operate in a certain way, or just because of the manipulation of preferences and desires or elimination of alternatives and so on? So wouldn't then this goes back to the initiation, to the kind of Mephistophelian objection, wouldn't then our current beliefs and practices then just reflect the outcome of that power struggle rather than anything more dignified from a normative perspective? And so we can call this the perspective of the present, which has a sort of arrogance and thinks that it has a moral superiority towards the past, but actually it's just a result of these power struggles. So I think we can be a bit stricter on how we think about this connection between the survival of specific historical outlooks and the counterfactuals that make our account and our analysis of that plausible or implausible. So we can say that not all surviving norms are progressive, and that the function of justice is refined only if successive generations are willing to endorse, hypothetically, the principles that they have, even without the constraints that brought them to uphold those principles in the first place. So let me give an example. Let's say, as we said, the fundamental function of justice is to justify the use of power with reference to this distinction between acceptable power and coercion. And we said that the function will be served by different political schemes, different political institutions at different points in time. Now, imagine that for whatever, in a society, you have a set of institutions that generates norms of deference to birth rank, for example. So one way in which justice discharges its function of regulating the use of power is by committing people to a society where there are hierarchical norms, and so a society of slaves and slave owners. And so thanks to the power and the coercive means of those who belong to the master's rank, the slaves are brought to submission and endorse the norms. Now, imagine for whatever reason, natural catastrophe, war, a change in epistemic insight, people discover something new that they didn't know before, the society is challenged, and there's the crisis that this society faces, a crisis of kind of legitimacy, and people start questioning the way that they have organized their institutions. So given these alternatives, would the next generation of members of that society continue to endorse these norms of deference to authority based on birth rank? And would the justification of power based on birth rank continue to be upheld despite the disappearance of the initial constraints, whether they were epistemic constraints or constraints to do with subjection to domination or inability to act and so on? So if the answer is that it wouldn't survive, that view wouldn't survive when all the counterfactuals are different, that body of norms that may at one point have contributed to the functional refinement of justice no longer serves its historical role, and so gets replaced with a progressive view, with a more progressive one. So one way to think about this is as a kind of, another, maybe a more intuitive way for some people, is to think of it as a kind of intergenerational reflective equilibrium, I suppose. But this argument raises another objection that I also want to consider briefly, which is that it might look like it's only giving us ex post reconstructions of learning processes that we have now internalized, but it's unable to generate forward-looking prescriptions for the future. So how does reflecting on an injustice of the past help us think about the future? How does this, what we know about the way, what we have learned from historical failures and successes, how does it help us think about the assessment of what we need to do in the future? So let me go back to, again, this example I gave of capitalism and the tensions of capitalism and democracy under conditions of globalization. And again, on the account that I was suggesting, we start by paying attention to instances of contestation, and we try to understand the claims that are made by different political agents who are contesting the status quo, and how their reasons are connected to reasons that other agents gave in the past in instances of contestation. So what kind of moral reasons are they bringing? And one upshot of this is when we think about the functional refinement of justice, what we can do from this learning process is we can exclude from normative consideration instances that embody moral regress. In other words, that tell us, that take us backwards compared to where we have arrived in our understanding of the norms of justice. So people who advocate, for example, racist principles, or people who advocate exclusions based on arbitrary criteria that seem to be not justified, they can be in some ways discarded when we're thinking about how we innovate, what kind of principles do we take, and which instances of political practice do we pay attention to. So rather than celebrating all kinds of political conflicts as important for purposes of the theory, we have again these two stages. In the first instance, we look at all of them. In the second instance, we think about what kind of commitments each of these agents who are acting and contesting the status quo reflect in society, and we think about what these commitments are telling us in terms of their connection to past commitments. So we think about, neo-fascist movements and the links between what they are saying now and what they were doing in the present, and how their views might have entrenched certain norms that we consider now as morally regressive and exclusionary. So rather than, as I say, celebrating, we kind of zoom on the kind of politics that reflects from what we learned from the past and excludes for this innovating stage these proposals that don't contribute. And that's not to deny that there is always a kind of a gray area where you might be unclear. There may be movements where it's not so obvious whether they're racist or whether they're tracking fascist commitments and so on. But I think the work of this theory is to at least reduce the scope of analysis and sort of reduce the object of consideration, excluding the views that fall short of what we now know and what advances we have now made in questions of justice. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up now by saying that the question of progress is so tricky, and the question of political progress is so tricky, because progress is both, on the one hand, a necessary idea, which is what I tried to suggest to begin with, but it's also a very dangerous idea. And we know this because in the name of progress, people have also sanctioned paternalism, narratives of colonial superiority and domination, narratives of civilizational hierarchy. And my idea is that with this more pragmatic approach to the question of progress, and with this sharper distinction between political progress and moral progress, we can arrive at an account of progress that is both universal, but also critical. It's universal because it rests on forms of moral learning that apply to normative constraints that are shared by all human beings, regardless of race and gender and ethnicity or social position, social class, but also critical because it helps us, with this account of progress, expose ideological appropriations of discourses of progress, like the ones that we have seen in the 19th century, where exactly in the name of progress, actually the purpose, the mission of learning from history, and this approach, which is much more nuanced and much more grounded and much more sensitive to contextual dynamics, was actually used to distort the meaning of progress and often betrayed this very emancipatory demand that is at the core of discussions on progress. And the other thing is to say that if we have a political account of progress that's on the one hand connected to the question of moral progress, but also works in tandem with social science and with the way in which empirical disciplines think and help us think about claims in society, contestations of social order, and so on, it means that political philosophy doesn't just deliver a kind of blueprint for action, and it doesn't just resolve every crisis that we face, and we can't just go to it as this ready-made, 10-point program of the political theories telling us giving us a red book with which we go and change the world. But it helps us, I think more clearly about the principles that are at stake. It helps us distinguish between different kinds of conflicts in society. It helps us make the case for how those conflicts ought to be paid more attention or less attention in the public sphere. And it helps us reflect on the normative proposal and the normative potential of different views that are put forward by different political groups. So again, I don't think political progress on this account should be understood as this sort of triumphant march towards the end of history. It's more a kind of fragile and sensitive to context and contested and ongoing process of learning, which depends on a collective ability, which in many ways takes place in democratic sites and is not just limited to academia or to sites of learning or to institutions of learning, but it's a kind of contribution to this collective ability to refine the function of justice, even in more demanding circumstances. And so I think when we reclaim progress in this way, we then return to reclaiming a kind of critical language that is necessary to confront the crisis of the times in which we live. And it's also necessary to reimagine a political future that isn't just different, but that we can say is genuinely better from the past. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we do have time for questions. There are 2 microphones, if people would line up, and we'll alternate.
About this, yeah. Thank you so much for your talk. I would like to hear a bit more about this process you mentioned of determining the kind of implicit commitments of people within political conflicts. I think this is very tricky. For one, people's commitments are not always transparent, even to themselves. It might even be that our deepest commitments are the things we are least able to see. And then second, you might worry that these commitments only come out in retrospect, especially historical retrospect. And part of the thing that your theory is trying to do is be useful for us now and not merely to say, with the benefit of hindsight, that something was progress. So if you could just say a bit more about how you imagine that process of determining the implicit commitments going, I would find that very illuminating. Thank you.
So there's 2 kinds of societies in which this question, I think, needs to be answered differently, right? So there are societies where there is no basic democratic sphere and no public sphere in a way that might help you track those commitments and those concerns. And then there's a separate discussion where you have a more liberal democracy where actually there is public protest and there are signals around, what the political parties and democratic movements, or even if they're not democratic, civil society movements, activist movements, are there to represent the claims of people. I think in the second case, there is ideological or party political, or there is a filtering of views that's just what representative democracy is about, right? So a lot of modern democracy or modern politics is representative politics, and representative politics is about agents that are there, like political parties or like civil society movements, that are there to try and articulate what the commitments of people are, and often citizens will go to one movement or another because they feel that there is a kind of intuitive response, an intuitive appeal. So they will go to, there will be an offer, let's call it an offer of certain views, and citizens will then go to those views, and there'll be another alternative one, and people who have a different kind of concern will go. So for me, this is a balance of the kind of concerns and commitments that are reflected through public protest and public contestation. And I understand that the question is slightly different in societies where there is no public contestation. But actually, even in societies where there is no public contestation, there are mechanisms through the cultural sphere in which you can see what's stirring people. So I think of, my example is always my own country, Albania, during communism. At one level, you don't have any sense of public protest. So you don't really know what are the concerns that the government is not responding to. What are the kinds of things that people are not articulating because they're not allowed to articulate it. But on the other hand, there are lots of mechanisms, cinema, literature, where even though there is censorship, it filters the debate, will just give you these insights into what might be provoking. And of course, you also have underground dissident movements and more secret type operations. So I think the answer is different, but for me, it does take the form of public contestation of one kind or another, whether it's public in the dissident form, in the sort of Solidarność, or in the old way where it takes the form of contestation of power, or whether it's public in the form that is allowed and recognized of manifestations and protests and strikes and so on.
Thank you.
Did that turn it on? Oh, it looks like it did. Okay, great. This is an excellent lecture. Thank you very much for giving us this great lecture. I have a question regarding the moment where you reject the Thrasymacheian or Mephistophelian view near the end, where it seems that part of what we're doing is we're thinking of a bunch of counterfactuals about alternate ways history could have gone, and we're asking, would we still have these sort of political and moral commitments in a case with a really alternative history? My worry with this proposal is that seems like something we have very little epistemic access to, in the sense where these networks of power and coercion that might be, over the long run, influencing which kind of things we think are true, they have hold on us for a really long period of time, and it's not always clear what they are or where they're coming from. So as to even properly evaluate what we could think on a totally different historical trajectory. So I'm wondering how it is you see that we can have any kind of epistemic access to guess which things are going to be progressive rather than not, if it involves this kind of really complicated counterfactual reasoning.
So I think if the view of history is what Kant calls a moral terrorism view, which is that it's all an accumulation of tragedies and it piles layer after layer and it's just power all the way down, then it's very difficult. And so this account can't answer that question. That's why I started by asking people to commit to an alternative view of thinking about the moral, and then from there build this way of thinking about political power, which tries to connect the political to the moral one way or another. But I think this Thrasymachos, the Nietzschean objection, the Mephistophelian objection, I think is really hard to answer if you think that all we have is just the result of that. And so any notion of rights and justice and universality and freedom and all of these values, they're just redescriptions of some powerful group doing certain things to another to a powerless group. I tend to think that maybe that's too strong. And so that there is something in the historical processes that we have been part of as humans, whereby for whatever reason we have come to an insight, to an epistemic insight of what it means to have a non-exclusionary point of view or an other regarding point of view or a point of view that thinks about relations between humans in a slightly more optimistic way. And then we hold on to those, and then we think, what are the instances of political practice where we see that reflected? And it doesn't have to be accumulative. But it's enough that they're not just destructive, that they don't completely disappear, that there is something that stays. And again, sometimes it stays in the legal norm, sometimes it stays in the culture, sometimes it can stay in the memory and the mechanisms that are not just the political mechanism. But I do think the only thing that I need to be committed to is that there is something about this insight that we have developed and that we do know, actually, that, I don't know, the abolition of slavery, for example, was genuinely a progressive, and that has given us an insight into how we ought to relate to each other, and from there we can then build much more robust criteria with the help of democratic or political practice.
Testing. Oh, okay. So I'm kind of probably the least educated person in the room, so this might be a softball question or clarifying question, but I was thinking about like the founding of the United States and how learned a lot of its founders were, and now I guess I've heard of a joke that the representatives have become all too representative. So I'm kind of curious, how do I, in the context of your lecture, make sense of whether we're progressing or regressing, and like what's the kind of coordinate plane that we graph that on, and who decides that?
Well, I mean, in the US, it seems to me pretty safe to say that we are regressing right now. And that you can see that in even just without going into what institutions do to become more robust in terms of responding to the challenges of the future and the crisis of capitalism, so the more demanding things that I was saying. If you think about it just in terms of there is something to the rule of law, there is something to the separation of power, there is something to sheltering and to isolating economic elites from having too much access to representation, and that each of these this is a more progressive way of thinking about the relationship between power and coercion, and there's a way in which we think justice refines a certain use of power, and the use of power whereby economic elites, for example, can completely dominate political discourse or force the state to do certain things. I think there is a lot that you can say about the state of the US right now, and you can then it's a methodological question, what is the scale to which you're going to do this? Is going to do it with specific decisions, so piecemeal, you think about any particular executive act, or executive decision that Trump makes, and ask yourself, how does this feature in this chain of events, and this is taking us backwards or forward? Or you can do it in a more, you think about the entire legislative, so you take a 4-year term, and these are more empirical methodological discussions that I don't think this framework, this account can answer in the specific. But by and large, I think the US right now is actually a very good test case, because you can see how there are certain commitments, even to what has driven its constitution, even to thinking about the US as, a melting pot. And there you have elected officials that make white supremacist claims publicly and reshape the public sphere in such a way that those claims are normalized. And that's a very good example of moral regress.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. Is this working? No. Working?
How about now? Okay. A number of things you spoke of, concepts, bring to mind Habermas. And this is a difficult question, but I'm wondering I was thinking about, in his earlier work, talking about legitimation crisis in liberal democracy, where you have a recurring, cycles in capitalism, recurring economic crisis. The state steps in and, has to try to balance economic vitality with more egalitarian considerations, but it happens over and over and over again. It's almost like rather than progress, it's kind of or regress, it's kind of a stasis. I happen to think myself that what we talk about a lot is identity politics kind of obscures more fundamental issues of economic inequality and how that fuels extremism and in the political sphere. So I'm just wondering how what you're talking about today might address this idea of legitimation crisis in the economic sphere.
Yeah, thank you. So that's very helpful, actually, also to clarify how I think about it, because I feel like I have a lot of sympathy for that Habermasian view, but then I also think that one of the limitations of that view is that it thinks about changes, or what we might call in my language, functional refinement of justice, in the language just of rights within the nation state, or at most the kind of EU constellation framework. So when Habermas thinks about how can we fix the world, what he's doing exactly when he discusses those crises of legitimacy, he thinks of emancipation that comes through just the system of rights, and that is to say the system of liberal rights. And the earlier Habermas, which was much more about the system of rights articulated in parallel with the discussion around the mode of production, so the economic distribution of resources, it was a much more accurate way of thinking about diagnosing the questions. And I don't think, one of the reasons why a lot of our answers now are answers to the conflicts of globalization that take the form of membership is the result of the view that thinks that just by changing access to rights within a particular constellation, you're going to take care of the problems of globalization. And that's because I think you've missed a fundamental element of the dynamic of the analysis of the development of capitalism, which is that there is a form of power that is escaping this control by nation states. That's what I was trying to say. So, there's recognitional conflicts and distributive conflicts. They go together. But if you think that the answer is just fixing each state, either it so happens that all of them do it at the same time and then capital can't go anywhere, or if the possibility that capital runs away and then sort of goes and invests in a different country, and the asymmetries and inequalities of power between the north and the south of the world make it very difficult for example, states like Albania to do the kinds of things that Habermas wants to do in Germany. So then they are much more open and they're willing to receive the capital that kind of runs away in this way. If you miss that really important element to thinking about globalization, and it's an empirical argument, but I think has a normative upshot, which is that the answer can't just be emancipation through membership. And the reason the right has become so, I think, has such political purchase now is that the right has sort of taken that narrative and says, okay, fine, if you want membership, then we'll give you the closed commercial state, which is the Fichtean answer to the development, or was the 18th century answer to the crisis of commercial society, when, people could see that the state was unable to contain the expansion of commercial society, and then Fichte came up and said, fine, then let's just have the closed commercial state. And if the answer is just membership, and it takes place at this level of the nation state, then you can see why the right then runs with that narrative and then turns it into a narrative of exclusion and filtering and unmixing of peoples, as I call it, and so on. And that's because I think we've just, the Habermasian framework has lost this other element, which was the more historical materialist component in that narrative of legitimacy and legitimation.
Hello, working? Okay. Professor Ypi, I want to say thank you for the lecture. I'm an undergraduate student here, so I don't have much of a knowledge base, but I wanted to bring up, I wanted to hear your thoughts on an ethical dilemma that might be more relevant to our modern world than the slavery one that you were bringing up when you were talking. And it's actually something that we're talking right now in one of my philosophy classes. So the majority of our food is produced and controlled by a small amount of companies, right? But politicians who hold a lot of power, let's say in Congress or in legislature, may have power in these companies, okay? And so the ethical question here is it ethical for these politicians to have power in our government, in the same government that is supposed to regulate the food that the majority of us Americans eat? And so I kind of wanted to ask you, your thoughts on that and how it relates to your political progress talk. Thank you.
So I don't think there was ever a point in a capitalist state where business had absolutely no impact on politics. So even in the golden age of social democracy, you had lobbying and you had mechanisms from which, certain interests of money-based interests or certain economic interests could actually have much greater share and much more of a voice. And so even in the paradise case of Scandinavian social democracy, you can actually see that there is a lot of influence that comes from capital into the political. But what we have now, I think, is a sort of, it's not an either or. I think in capitalism, money just rules. And to what degree it rules depends on what resources you have to counter it and what kind of movements there are in society that can revitalize democracy such that it puts pressure on governments, it puts pressure on representative democracy, it manages to have political parties articulate certain claims that contain the market and so on. And the problem now is that I think because of a lot of progressive have somehow, the critique of capital and the critique of money has become sidetracked. You don't have this response, and so you have much less possibility in the public sphere, in the political sphere, to actually counter the power of capital. And what you have in the extreme, in the US now, is completely extreme because you literally have the representatives of business sitting on boards. And so you have Palantir. I was just reading in July, the US military gave a 10 billion contract to Palantir and Related for very, very critical defense infrastructure. So these are core functions of the state that are being handed over to business owners and to oligarchs and to business elites. Again, I think I want to say that it's a continuum, so I don't think there was ever a point where money was completely ruled out of representative politics, but I think now we're at a point where in the absence of counter-democratic movements, you just have literally the owners of business and capital that are showing up and also ruling. And the ideology is also one that, as Peter Thiel says, capitalism and freedom and democracy are not compatible because he thinks of freedom as just innovation, so just technological development, and he thinks as regulation as something that stops innovation. And he thinks that democratic movements in society that make an opposite argument are just delaying and slowing down on economic growth and so on. So then you have a political narrative that is driven entirely by the business interests and by the business elite.
Hi there. So I want to go back to that super interesting question about how do we recognize progress and regress, and your really interesting response that started with, well, I think that we're now in the United States in a period of regress. It's clear, and I don't know. So let me say why I don't know. And it has a little bit to do with the very first question, which was about commitment. And so let me try something out on you and see what you think. And I'm thinking a lot about democratic norms and their fragility and what causes democratic norms to be sustained or, as you were speaking about in kind of midway through your lecture about coordination and also about continuity. I see norms as really fragile and prone to decay, especially when they're not challenged. And we're at a very particular moment right now that is really challenging them. And in the response to the first question about commitment, you said, look, protest, people speaking out, this is really important. I think, there are various ways of thinking why it's so important. It has to do with coordination, but it also has to do with recognition, establishing common knowledge of the existence of and our commitment to these democratic norms, socially experienced. Right? So I think about, to whatever extent others in the room share frustration with the current administration, that is just a symptom of a decay of democratic norms that have been going on for a long time because we've really enjoyed we've been coddled, right? And that this may be the very moment for our democratic norms to be strengthened. And so this may counterintuitively be a moment of real progress. Just want to try that out on you.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't think that every instance of political activism is a progressive one. And so in that sense, a representative, without this account of what counts as progress, what counts as regress, and how do we think about progressive and regressive political movements, someone from the MAGA movement would say, actually, we had a real moment of challenge of the elites, and there was a real resurgence, and Trump is popular, and you go to his rallies and you see people really get involved, and so it is not just an elite phenomenon. So this is clearly something about upholding some activist norm or other. But whether they are democratic norms, I'm not so sure, because I think the standard for what counts as a democratic norm is is a bit higher when we're thinking about power and the justification of power and how we think about freedom. So I have an account of democracy that I think is maybe more robust, and that would say that what you have in the US is not really democracy. It's some hybrids, and right now it's more oligarchy than democracy, but if you have a robust democratic standard, you've actually never really had proper functioning democracy, because in part this business, lobbying, distribution of money and resources and entrenchment, constitutional, I'm not going to go in the details. So I think, yeah, I would say that we have activism, but yeah, there was activism in Germany in the 1930s as well, and it wasn't progressive, but it was, somehow people were responding and they thing. This is why I think this question of political progress is so important, because the fact that people care about something, what is political progress populates the answer to what is it that you're caring about, and what does this do to the world as a whole or to society more, by a standard that's wider than just the standard of the people who care somehow.
Really good talk. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, when you're looking at political progress, is there an institutional level that you find best to assess it at? Like, is it at the highest levers of power, like in the United States in Congress? Or are you looking at it as an aggregate of all the institutions that make up the system that you're evaluating? Or are there certain like keystone institutions that you can kind of weather vane the rest of the system by, depending on the way that politics is progressing at those levels? I was just curious about that.
Well, I think it depends on how demanding you want to make this question, how demanding your account is of power and its justification, right? So I think if it's very, very demanding like mine, then it has to be at all levels. In part, it has to be about international institutions, because it's not enough to reform democratically specific nation states if you don't think about the overarching international institutional architecture. It's about then domestic institutions, both at the constitutional level, but then also at lower level, like regional and federal units where you have federation. It's about civil society, so it's about also exactly people not becoming too complacent and not sleeping and not letting the politicians do their work and think that there is this division of labor whereby you can just be at home and they'll take care of, because that also, as Machiavelli shows, makes the political become more and more corrupt, and so it's also regressive in many ways. I mean, a lot of Machiavelli's stuff on Rome was exactly about the role and the relevance of participation and of power sharing between what he called the people and the grandi, the powerful. And so I think the answer has to be a composite, and how much of all of that depends on how strong and how demanding your account of progress is.
A lot of sense. Thank you.
So I wanted to ask about how much political progress is kind of, are you understanding as holding fixed traits of the populace? In the sense that, like, I mean, so it seems like a problem that can happen in some societies is that public opinion is illiberal and inegalitarian enough that, like, if the government represents the people and, you know, trades sides often enough, then from time to time, the government will be one that, you know, goes against liberal egalitarian values in a serious way. So is that a situation where, like, you would say that there's kind of a limit to how much political progress can be made until the populace changes its opinions? Is that one where, like, change in public opinion can constitute political progress? Or is political progress supposed to be something that's kind of a matter of progress for a given polity taken as it is, as opposed to considering, like, how it might change in terms of public opinion?
I mean, I think that, actually, I think political progress is more robust. And so we're thinking about a continuum here. And I think it's more robust when political norms become also white norms. And sometimes you have political developments where certain political norms are there, they're very progressive, but somehow society is not ready for them. And so they're not shared, they're not entrenched, and that means they're much more vulnerable to being subverted with the change in political elite or political regime. So in that sense, I think kind of, I suppose, enlightened public opinion is what is that as a result is what comes out at the end. It's not something that you can begin with or you can rely on. Having said that, I also think that a lot of public opinion can also be about intuitive instances of reaction to injustice. And so that I don't think that you need sometimes you don't need a lot of education to respond to certain evils of the world. And so you can see that also very uneducated people can actually take the right side, be on the right side. It's not that the elite always has it right when it comes to public opinion and social norms and what counts as progressive and regressive.
Do you have a view of the relationship between political progress and legal progress? Is legal progress an example of political progress, an instance of it? Is it a constituent of political progress, or is it something that can occur independently? Can there be legal progress without political progress, or vice versa?
No, I think, I tend to think that the legal institutions are one of the most important sites where you actually, when you make political progress always starts with a group, right, with a party that is the party of progress. And it's interesting, it's real progress when we forget that it started as a party of progress. So I think about always the example of Kant and the French Revolution. So Kant writes about the French Revolution and he says, the French Revolution is a sign of progress. And he says, we can see that it's a sign because everyone got so excited when it happened. And of course, at exactly the same time, Burke was writing against the French Revolution and was saying it's a terrible mess and it's so horrible. What was there before was dismantled and what came after was a pure bloodshed. And there were a lot of people like Burke as well. It's not that Kant controlled public opinion at that time. But what's really interesting is that now we read it and we think of that as an account of, Kant said it was a sign of progress because the impartial spectators who watched the French Revolution all thought it was great. And we, as descendants of these impartial spectators and impartial spectators ourselves in time, think of it and say, yeah, that makes sense. The French Revolution, sure, maybe it went wrong in certain applications, but the ideas were right and they entrenched certain progressive norms. And I think that's why it's so interesting that it's a genuine. It's the same thing with slavery. I'm sure I don't know the debates around slavery in this country, but probably a lot of people didn't think that abolishing slavery was a great idea. It was not hegemonic, and it was not, because otherwise it wouldn't be there if it had been hegemonic, that there shouldn't be slaves. But it becomes the mainstream, and then evil people who objected to it somehow are ashamed to say that they ever supported it. And this is why I think it's really interesting to think about these processes of continuation, historical continuation, because you can still do this genealogical work where Giorgia Meloni now, she will never say that she's a fascist because she's ashamed, and fascism of that kind has been discredited by history somehow. We've learned from history that that was not the right way to think about political institutions. So of course she'll never say, I'm a fascist, I like Mussolini, but you still know that if you trace down and you do kind of genealogical history of these movements, you know that the roots are there, and so you look to see in what new form this exclusion is coming back and this attitude is rearing its head. Yeah. Can I just say something? Because I just realized, looking at my notes, that I actually didn't answer the question. I went roundabout. The short answer is that yes, I think political progress is entrenched in legal progress, but as I was saying earlier, becomes robust and is more robust when it also trickles down and becomes social norms. And so then you don't need the law is sort of there, but nobody's not having slaves because it's illegal. They just think it's wrong. So I think it's difficult because I completely take the point that the data is biased and the sources of information are biased. But I personally don't think that there is anything new in this. So the forms of technology change, but I think information has always been biased. And I think there was a lot of progress in enlightenment even when the vast majority of people couldn't read and write. And so they didn't even have, I think education is a practice, and it's somehow, I think, overemphasizing the limits and the biased nature of information makes you complacent or makes you think that somehow it's the role of information or technology to be non-biased. I mean, this is in the hands of capital. They don't have an interest in educating people. This is just private companies that want to make money. So I think you're right that it's difficult, but we shouldn't emphasize how difficult it is. We need the kind of uplifting part of the story to say, yes, but it's difficult, but it has always been difficult. And somehow there has been progress. Again, this is like taking comfort from history. There have been moments in history where, despite the difficulties, people made it. There were these examples of challenging information bias, challenging epistemic bias. I was reading about the 20s and 30s and reading about the invention of the radio. And everyone was talking about how suddenly Hitler was in your living room. And so, how can we fight with the radio? How can we have this media that we used to have where somehow there was some control, and now we have this mass communication and the dictators are just there? And so I feel like, to some extent, some of the discussion that we have around digital media, social media, the changing nature of information, I take the point that it's very serious and needs to be taken seriously, but on the other hand, we also need to remember that it's not impossible.
Hear me all right? Cool. So is it part of your view that if the political contention process goes poorly and we get like immoral insights that are institutionalized, that those insights are not going to be robust in the way that the moral insights are? If it is part of your view, can you say a little bit more about why that's the case?
No, I mean, it's a difficult question, right? So I don't think you can say that when the immoral insight becomes entrenched in institutions and become the kind of political common sense, what I want to say is that the moral doesn't completely disappear, because there is something about the way in which we develop and we evolve, and there's some attitudes that we have towards each other that I think they're still there somehow. So, of course, there's an alternative point of view which says that because if it's all dependent on the political, then if these moral views get entrenched, then it's impossible. I think my take even on very extreme societies, on totalitarian societies and censored societies, is that people find resources to counter these entrenchments of immoral or regressive norms in political institutions out of sympathy, out of education, out of thinking about the past, out of examples of the past. Now, of course, if you destroy all knowledge and all culture, then it may be that this is also not going to last, but it seems very far-fetched somehow.
You sign up to the idea that there's a sense in which the moral universe bends towards justice?
Well, I mean, I suppose I'm saying, all I want to say is that it doesn't necessarily bend towards justice, so it depends on what we do. It bends towards justice if we act in such a way that we make it bend towards justice. And we can take comfort in the fact that in the past, people have acted in such a way, and there are these examples where even if it looked really difficult, it was possible, and that can sort of nourish our response to the future. But it's not something that is completely independent from how, as Kant was saying, the prophet needs to make the things that they prophesize. And so in that sense, you can't say it just works independently of human agency.
Thank you.
Where's the button? Okay. Wait, is it working now? Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you for the lecture. So basically, I'm wondering why it's necessary to shut down, I suppose, axiomatically, obviously incorrect viewpoints for the reason that they're allegedly obviously incorrect because they deviate from our own moral axioms contemporaneously, because it seems that that attitude or line of thought is intrinsically opposed to the concept of open thought and open debate. And at the same time, it seems it can be arbitrarily deployed by any ideological regime. And then if views that are obviously wrong are actually obviously wrong, the argument could be made that those views would then be, they would be self-defeating.
Where did I say that we need to shut down the incorrect views?
So I'm paraphrasing, of course, but what I mean is the line of thought of essentially, as a society, okay, I'm trying to make this short, because the view is that progress is something which is sort of self-correcting over time, and therefore the approach and also the axioms and the values themselves can be are mutable, right? Is that so? If that's the case, then I mean, if the approaches and the axioms can be mutable from generation to generation, then saying like, oh, you know, this X category of viewpoints, which is obviously morally wrong or morally taboo, should therefore not even be discussed to any degree. I'm just wondering why that would be necessary if one were to claim open debate. Like, for example, well, the early 20th century American dismissal or taboo of Marxism, and then so anyone who had Marxist sympathies had to essentially hide that. And of course, it was out of the question in academia, but then nowadays we have many academics who are openly Marxist. And then another example would be many communist states, their conception of progress was essentially, to some degree, communizing the world. And that was kind of like obviously correct beyond question because, again, because debate about that was essentially disallowed to oppose that axiom, essentially. Well, yeah, does that answer the question about the nature of my question? I guess one thing that informs it.
I think there is a misunderstanding because I wasn't saying, my argument is not about whether you allow or not allow fascist movements. My argument is when we're thinking about engaging with them politically, how do we argue about whether they can be seen as progressive movements that contribute to this process of functional refinement of justice or movements that hinder this process? Nothing I said is about shutting down anyone, actually.
Okay. I don't intend to misunderstand your...
What I said was that not all change is progress. So you can have change in a normative direction is regressive. So for example, when certain movements become hegemonic, then what you have entrenched is actually regress rather than progress, or there's been backsliding. And actually we use these terms as well, so it's not that they're mysterious. But all of this is within a context of democratic exchange about the nature of certain views and the nature of certain commitments and the political exchange that follows from that. So I don't think, I mean, if anything, my argument is that actually those kinds of claims help us engage, and rather, instead of sort of saying, oh, they're bad because they're bad people or because they're wrong, we can show, you know, what is it about those commitments that's actually problematic in this pragmatic way rather than in a way that says they're just, you know, they're terrible people or they have terrible claims and so on. It gives you a kind of historical analysis that grounds the engagement. So I think this is supposed to actually strengthen the debate rather than saying, since now we know that we're on the side of progress, everybody who doesn't can go to jail. So.
Can I ask a short follow-up question? So I'm wondering what you think about the, well, because there's one way of presenting a certain view of progress, which is that sort of coupling progress with, say, liberal democratic values, and then the opposition simply being the Mephistophelian point of view, which can umbrella Nietzsche, Machiavelli, etc. But then what about the alternative view that perhaps there are different groups may have axiomatically different conceptions of progress, there may be more than one, or perhaps the subjectivity of progress is a question, or maybe there being more than one right view of progress, and that there is an inherent subjective element of progress, either on a group or individual level.
So there's two ways of thinking about this claim. One is to say, because it's subjective, it's measurable, they're incomparable, and there is no way in which they can actually even engage in a debate and find a common core and develop a common core. That view I disagree with. So I think that's not plausible. I think cultures have, because it just relies on an essentialist understanding of culture that's actually not what culture really is. Culture emerges out of views that seem to be in disagreement and then find ways of compromising and negotiating and construct core commitments that are shared across intersubjective disagreements. So I think that's just implausible. If the argument is that its subjectivity means that there are different ways of thinking about claims of progress and their relation to, say, existing norms of justice, what I said was methodological. I mean, I gave you one example why I thought, for example, liberal democracy is not doing its job because it's not taking seriously capitalism. And so that's not the status quo. That's not liberal democracy as we have it. It's just an account of how actually liberal democracy needs to take on some of its sort of progressive and then think about how can I think about this history in a forward-looking way that makes me respond to certain crises in the world and to globalization. So that's just an application of the method. But I haven't really given you a kind of substantive view. Even that was just an example, and we can carry on talking about it. What I've given you is a set of criteria through which we can think, and it's possible that these criteria are somehow reflected by a number of movements, and that these movements or these political groups are also maybe in fundamental disagreement with each other. But there we're in the realm of what Rawls would call reasonable disagreement. So there's a sense in which you can still negotiate your way, or you can think about how you develop and how you emerge from these disagreements. The claim that is really hard to respond to is the first one, which says, well, because it's disagreement, then everybody who agrees has their own metric, and therefore they just, they go ahead with their metric, you go ahead with yours. I think that's just not a very plausible way of thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you.